from Second Bava Kama from this past week's set of learning, and it's centered on 91, page 91, on the Daf. And so I'm going to share it here. Now, when it comes to this particular Daf, the focus is on the aspect of humiliation and of the sense as to what are the penalties for humiliating an individual. Interestingly, there's a major difference between humiliation by words and humiliation by actions. And by actions, what I specifically mean is that you are going to actually cause physical harm. And that physical harm is the definition of humiliation, not necessarily the actual words. So think of the saying, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. There is a certain kind of sense that that is what is at play here. But in order for us to get to that point, to learn about that and to also learn a little bit more about how Gemara works, how the Talmud works, which I've talked about before, that sense of orality. We're going to start very briefly going through the particular Mishnah that's going to be the center of the sugya that we're going to learn. So it's chapter 8, Mishnah 6. If you're interested, I'm happy to put together, to share with you the sources separately, but I'm also using the PowerPoint here for a particular purpose that you're going to see soon. So, one who strikes another must give him a sela. Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of Rabbi Yossi HaGalili that he must give him 100 dinars. If he slapped another on the cheek, he must give him 200 dinars. If he slapped him on the cheek with the back of his hand, which is more degrading than a slap with the palm, he must give him 400 dinars. If he pulled his hair or pulled out his hair or spat at him and his spittle reached him, which is in the Hebrew, rakak v'higiabo, we're going to get to that. Or if he removed ve'evir, the other's cloak from him, or if he uncovered the head of a woman in the marketplace. In all of these cases, he must give the injured party 400 dinars. This is the principle of assessing payment for humiliation caused to another. Okay, so there's a specific amount of money. However, there's another opinion, and this one is also highlighted because we're going to go through it. It is all evaluated in accordance with the honor of the one who was humiliated. Hakol lefi chavodo, here in the Hebrew, as the Gemara will explain. Rabbi Akiva said, even with regard to the poor among the Jewish people, they are viewed as though they were freemen who lost their property and were impoverished, and their humiliation is calculated according to this status, as they are the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and are all a prominent lineage. The Mishnah so that piece is also going to be important that we're going to see a little bit later in terms of how it's used in the Gemara. That's in the Hebrew here. Afilu aniyim shebi Yisrael ro'inotam ke'ilu hem b'nei chorin she'yardu menichrisehem shehem b'nei Abraham Yitzchak v'Yaakov. And that is basically saying that even if the Jews are poor, that they're considered to be rich in a number of ways. And an incident occurred involving one who uncovered the head of a woman in the marketplace. And the woman came before Rabbi Akiva to request that he render the assailant liable to pay for the humiliation that she suffered. This exact issue is going to come up again in what we're going to learn. Umaseh be'echad shepara rosh ha'isha. And Rabbi Akiva rendered the assailant liable to give her 400 dinars. The man said to Rabbi Akiva, my teacher, give me time to pay the penalty. I don't have the money right now. Come back to me. I will be able to give it to you at some point. And Rabbi Akiva gave him time. The man then waited for her until she was standing by the opening of the courtyard. This is a fascinating story that we're going to touch on as well. And he broke a jug in front of her, and there was the value of about an isar of oil inside the jug. The woman exposed her own head, and she was wetting her hand in the oil and placing her hand on her head to make use of the oil. It's like, oh, there's something free for me to be able to make my hair look good. Let me be able to do that. The man set up witnesses to observe her actions, and he came before Rabbi Akiva and said to him, will I give 400 dinars to this woman for having uncovered her head? Meaning, if it was such a humiliation for me to uncover her head, she did it herself. So why should I pay the money? By uncovering her head for a minimal benefit, she's demonstrated that this does not cause her humiliation. Rabbi Akiva said to him, you did not say anything, meaning that this is pointless. This is not a relevant matter for the issue here, i.e. this claim will not exempt you, because one who injures himself, although it is not permitted for him to do so, is nevertheless exempt from any sort of penalty. but others who injured him are liable to pay him. And then he gives an example. So it doesn't matter what you do. It matters, like, if you decide to embarrass yourself, humiliate yourself, that's fine theoretically, but you can't, others are not allowed to be able to do so. So I just want to give that overview because a lot of this is going to appear in the sugya that we're going to look at right now. But for that, I want to focus a little bit on how the text is also written in a way where it represents the oral tradition that it can be very difficult to understand unless you kind of know everything else about it, that you know the Mishnah, you know the whole Mishnah. Here's an example. This is a direct translation of the Hebrew that you have above. Rakak v'higia bo harok, spat and spittle reached him, v'hevir v'chule, or he removed. That's a quote from the Mishnah we just read. Amar Rav Papa says, Lo shanu ella bo. They taught only him. Okay. Aval bevido la, but on his clothing, not. Well, that's a little bit confusing if you don't really know what he's referring to, because a lot of the references, a lot of the individuals or things that the text refers to is very unclear. You have to know what it is, or who is, or he is, or whatever it might be. So let's get more to that confusing kind of language. Let it be like humiliated with words. In the West, Amri b'marava mishmei de Rabbi Yossi bar Avin. In the West, they say in the name of Rabbi Yossi bar Avin, Zot omeret, that is to say, bishu b'devarim patur miklum. He humiliated with words, exempt from anything. Now, if you're confused, that's exactly what I'm trying to actually get at. The words themselves from the text, it can be very difficult to understand if we just take a look at the direct translation, which is why it is amazing that we have at our fingertips a translation that gives us the context of what's being said, even though that context is a rabbi's understanding of what he thinks is going on in the Talmud, particularly Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz, who put together this great translation of the Talmud. And he bases it a lot off of key rabbinic thinkers like Rashi, like Tosafot. So it's not like he's just making it up, but that he is giving all of us an opportunity to actually understand what's happening. So here's an example of that. The Mishnah teaches, if he spat at him and his spittle reached him, or if he removed another's cloak, he must give the injured party 400 dinars. Okay? Rav Papa says they taught this halakha about the 400 dinars only in the case where the spittle reached him. But if the spittle landed on his clothing without touching him, he is not required to pay him. Meaning that humiliation is only if you are actually affecting the individual themselves and not just necessarily the clothes that they have. That's what the commentators are saying is the point of Rav Papa. But then the Gemara asks the question, why not? Let it be like one who humiliated another with words. And then we get to the point where it's not just about affecting the individual in terms of their physical body, but about humiliation in another way, such as with words, thinking about defamation, which is especially right now in the news. The Gemara answers in the West, meaning the Gemara is now bringing up the answer to that question. Why can't we look at this as humiliation with words? In the West, Eretz Yisrael, they say in the name of Rabbi Yossi bar Avin, that is to say that if he humiliated another with words alone, he is exempt from paying anything. That is to say that what the Talmud is telling us here is there's no such thing as defamation. You can't humiliate someone with words and expect to be paid for it. But, and this again is not in the text itself, but is in the understanding of the rabbis of what the text means, although he will be held accountable by heaven for his sin, which I think is a nice way of saying that, if you're doing something wrong, if you're treating somebody the wrong way, we can't punish you, but God will call you to account. Okay, there you have that guilty conscience. Just want you to see a little bit about how a very difficult text to understand has a lot behind it and that rabbis over the centuries have tried to understand what it is that the Talmud is saying. And we are the beneficiaries of being able to use that learning to stand on their shoulders to better understand what the text is trying to teach us. Okay? Here's another example, though, that's really important and something I've talked about before in a number of ways if you've been here for this class. And that is demonstrating the orality of the text. In particular, the notion that this was transmitted orally from one person to the other. Now, if you've ever tried to memorize something, you know that the easiest way to memorize, or one of the easiest way to memorize, is when you have words that repeat themselves. That way, if you know one, then you're able to better know the other. I can say this when in learning how to read Torah, that when it came to understanding the trup, that the trup, if it is the same trup that kind of repeated itself in some ways, it made it easier for me to learn. In a similar sense, it's easier to remember the text if the language itself is repetitious in a way where it kind of reminds you about what the next thing is that you have to say, or the next thing it is that you have to remember about what the text is talking about. So here's an example of that. This has to do with the section in the Mishnah about the notion of that all in accordance with the honor, that there's another idea as to what the damages, what the reparations would be for humiliation, and that's in accordance with their particular honor, okay? But here's how the Talmud remembers that. Here's how the rabbis are kind of thinking about that. Ibai lehu tanakama lekula ka'amar o lechumra ka'amar? Is this point about that it's in accordance with the person's honor, is that for the purpose of a leniency or a stringency? The direct translation, a dilemma was raised before. The first Tana say as a leniency, or he says a stringency. So this is just a question that they're trying to answer. And what's fascinating about it is that it takes up this idea, Tanakama lekula o lechumra. Kula lechumra. So if I had that in my mind, now listen to this text as I'm kind of reading it in that sing-songy way of Talmud. And I divided this in terms of different colors in order for you to kind of get that sense. Lekula kamar deika ani de lobai lemishkal kule hai, o dilma lechumra kaamar deika ashir devai lemitav leitefe, meaning lekula kamar lechumra kaamar deika ani deika ashir de labae devae, which is the same word as bae, lemishkal kulehai lemitav leitefe. These words are kind of are repeating themselves in a way so that it's easier to remember the main question of lekula or lechumra, which is, he says as a leniency that there is a poor who doesn't need to take so much, or he says as a stringency that there is a rich who needs to give him more. Now, I think that's still a little bit confusing, so here we go. Again, with the help of the text that we now have in front of us, which includes that deeper understanding, the Mishnah teaches with regard to the assessment of payment for humiliation, it is all assessed in accordance with the honor of the one who was humiliated. A dilemma was raised before the sages. Does the Tana in the Mishnah say his opinion as a leniency, or does he say it as a stringency? The Gemara now will explain the two possibilities. It goes into a little bit more. He says his opinion as a leniency, teaching that there is a poor person who does not need to take so much payment for humiliation as detailed in the fixed sums of the Mishnah. So let's say, for instance, that if you spit on someone and they're wearing a certain kind of clothing on their body, that depending upon what those levels are, you may be paying a poor person more than they need in order to replace that clothing for that. Because again, humiliation is related to harm caused to their bodies. Or perhaps he says his opinion as a stringency, teaching that there is a rich person whom the assailant needs to give him more than those fixed sum. But for a rich person who's wearing something greater, that's money is not enough. And so it's a leniency for the poor because the poor you do not need to give as much money to them. But it could be a stringency in regards to the fact that you have to pay more than that sum to somebody who is rich. Now, we can have a larger conversation about what that really means, but the one thing I wanted to really unpack here is the way in which the Gemara remembers the question, how they're passing it along within the context of the tradition, so that people will be able to remember it moving forward. Now, here's another thing that I think is really fascinating about the way in which the text is remembered by rabbis over the course of time, and of understanding a little bit more about what's going on here. So there was a section in the Talmud, in the Mishnah, about the poor and Israel, how Israel has a greater value in terms of what they should be able to receive. What does that really mean? Tashma. Now, tashma is a great phrase if you haven't really understood that before. Tashma means here's something important for you to learn. You're going to come and understand it. You're going to come and learn it. And just the language, tashma, that 2-syllable phrase rolls off the tongue. It's got that alliteration. And it also is a way for us to understand that there's something important coming up here for us to learn, even if it may not inherently be connected to the question that came before it. Because this particular answer is not necessarily going to be connected, but then we're going to see at the end how it is. So Tashma, Mita Kamar Rabbi Akiva. So we're going to come and learn what Rabbi Akiva had said in the Mishnah. Afilu aniyim shebe Yisrael, ro'inotan ke'ilu hem b'nei chorin sheyardu menichnesehem, shehem b'nei Abraham, Yitzhak, Yaakov. Come here what Rabbi Akiva says, even poor the Jewish people, they're viewed as though they were freemen who lost their property, as they are the sons of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so, Shmamina, Tana Kama Lakula Kamar, Shmamina. So that Shma, that Tashma, is also kind of then leading into this idea of Shma Mina, learn from it, Mina, from this particular teaching. And what that really is saying here is that we're going to find an answer to the question that was being asked. But what's also fascinating about it is just to recognize Shma Mina here at the beginning and Shmamina at the end. Shmamina, Tanakama Lakula Kamar, Shmamina. Conclude from the first Tana says is leniency, conclude from it. As if it's an easier way to remember it by virtue of repeating the important phrase that allows you to know why it is that I'm remembering it, because this is giving me the answer to the question that I'm trying to ask. So to better understand exactly what he's saying here, the Gemara suggests come and hear a proof from that which Rabbi Akiva says in the Mishnah. We talked about this, about the poor of the Jewish people, that they're a prominent lineage. And so here's the point about why he's coming to say this and how it does answer the question from before. Conclude from Rabbi Akiva's statement that the first Tana says his opinion as a leniency, meaning that while the first Tana states the principle that payment for humiliation is in accordance with the honor of the one who was humiliated, and therefore a poor person will receive less than the fixed sums listed in the Mishnah, Rabbi Akiva responds that even a poor man is deserving of those fixed sums by virtue of his esteemed lineage. Meaning that when the Mishnah says poor, what it really means, what Rabbi Akiva says, is that when it comes to Jews, that they're not considered to be poor, they're considered to be rich. And given the fact that they are considered to be rich, then by virtue of saying that you have to give in honor of the one who was humiliated, that by virtue of that even a poor man who is deserving of those fixed sums, that even a poor man is deserving of the particular fixed sums by virtue of that esteemed lineage. And therefore, because the original question was saying that if it had to do with the poor, that it would be a leniency, given the fact that it's talking about Jews, even the ones who are poor, that it is considered to be a leniency. Now, we can unpack that in terms of if that is really that clear about how it's connected inherently to the question that was being asked. But I think what's important here is to understand that the way in which the editors of the Gemara are setting this up is, one, to be able to better remember all of the different pieces of what is being passed down orally, and that they're also trying to get to a point. They're trying to get to what is the answer? what is the question that first of all, what is the question we're trying to ask about what the Mishnah or the Talmud is saying, what these rabbis are talking about, and then how can we get to the right answer? Now, because of time, I know what time it is right now. It's 9:58. I have one more set that I think is going to be a really interesting one in regards to how the text is, how the text itself is trying to work out what answers are, meaning how do we get to the point where we understand what is the main question and what is the right answer? Because a lot of Talmud learning is not just about having these really interesting ideas, but also it's about getting to what is the halacha, what is the actual point of what it is that we're trying to learn. So I would like to be able to do that, but I also understand the time right now. And so I want to pause for a second and see if anybody has any particular questions. And otherwise, I'm happy to continue to learn for those who want to stay.
Your Rabbi Sachs, please feel free to raise your hand if you have a question. I noticed with that last text, I couldn't help thinking that Rabbi Akiva spent a lot of his life poor.
Right.
And had special empathy, no doubt, for poor people. Aaron asks, is the text saying that a poor person should get the same amount of money as a rich person?
It is saying that that is correct, meaning that if a poor person would actually be able to, if a poor person would be given according to whatever their honor is, that they would be given a lot less. But by virtue of a poor person, a poor Jew, actually being considered to have that kind of positive lineage, that they would get that which is more applicable to somebody who may be who may be more well off. Thus, and because you can't necessarily tell that by virtue of their clothing or whatever the honor is compared to what the exact amounts are, then the larger amount represents a greater giving to the poor when they may not necessarily actually be deserving of it. So they're getting a larger amount.
All right. And Yoram says, what about honor, the kavod of a person independent of their assets, just by being human?
Right.
So now we get into the thorny of questions of, did the rabbi see all human beings as equal, right?
And for that point, I think what's really interesting about this issue is that when it comes to humiliation, they're not talking about the moral or the spiritual element of humiliation. That is to say, and I was actually going to get a picture of this. One of my favorite shows is The Simpsons. And there's one character whose name is Nelson. And he always seems to appear and he points out the individual when something bad happens, saying, ha ha, see what you did, or see how terrible you are. And that you can get that feeling of somebody being humiliated. That's not what this text is talking about. It's talking about how if someone not just degrades you in public, but that they are causing injury. And that's actually going to be a piece that we're going to talk about if you decide to stay on for the last sugya. And yeah, I see the comment. That's what's so interesting. That is one of the points that I was struck by this text, and why I wanted to talk about it is that the text is definitely saying that humiliation is by physical acts as opposed to the mental kind of damages that we see much more prevalent now.
Yeah, and we have one or two comments that are also pointing out that even if no physical damage is done immediately, it can have repercussions, like physical repercussions. I think somebody said, maybe in terms of marriage prospects or something, right? If you humiliate somebody, even if in that moment you're not causing physical or material damage, that
it could theoretically
have a knock-on effect.
Right. Which we see that in the courts when it comes to cases of defamation, because what they're trying to get at is what is the monetary harm that could happen, that could be caused by virtue of this particular act. But the difference in what it's saying the point that was made in the Mishnah about how if you spat on somebody's clothing but not on their body is really indicating that it is about what happens to you physically as opposed to that mental kind of condition. And that when it comes to a lot of aspects of Jewish law, it's talking about the here and now and not about the future. I'll give one very quick, for instance, the law of pikuach nefesh, of saving a life. Pikuach nefesh dochesh Shabbat. You're allowed to save a life. You're allowed to break Shabbat in order to save a life. But there are particular rules around that. You're only allowed to save a life if their life is in particular danger in that moment. If it's potential danger, you're not allowed to break Shabbat. So let's say, for instance, that you know somebody who is traveling to you on Shabbat, and you think that it's a very dangerous road that they're going to be going on, and you think, oh my God, I don't want them to go that route. I want them to go a different route. Let me call them on Shabbat to make sure that they're safe. Does not get to the level of pikuach nefesh because it's not the harm that is potentially happening in this moment. Judaism, Jewish law, or specifically Talmudic law is focused on what is happening right now and is not focused on the potential future repercussions.
Interesting. All right, let's take one more question. Lots of good comments. I'm sorry if we can't get to everything. A basic understanding question. Kula and chumra.
Yeah.
Leniency, stringency. What exactly do those words mean in this legal context?
So the interesting thing about it, and as we were going through it, the way in which the text itself, and if we had more time, I would kind of go through this a little bit deeper. The way in which the text used the comment from Rabbi Akiva to decide on leniency is a little bit of a roundabout way. I'm not going to go through that right now. But the basic idea of a kula and a chumra is this. If there is a rule in which you have to if you have to pay a certain amount of money, let's just say that you owe somebody $200, okay? And then you go through a process by which that amount of money is challenged because of another issue, such as, let's say I can't afford $200. And so I'm going to give you my tax forms, and you're going to decide based upon what my tax forms say about how much I actually owe. So if I owe less than that $200 because of my tax forms, then if I decide to pay based off of what my tax forms say, that's a leniency because I would owe $100 instead of $200, right? Leniency meaning I would pay less than what is the actual specific amount. However, if I give you my tax forms and it shows that I could not just afford $200, but I could actually afford $400 or $500, then that same rule would make me pay $500 instead of the $200, which is more stringent. A great example of this is the tax code that we have. Is it a progressive tax code or is it a fixed amount? If it's a fixed amount compared to a progressive tax code, then depending upon your tax bracket, that progressiveness may be more lenient because you would pay less than what you would need, or it would be more stringent because you would have to pay more. So that's the idea of kula and chumra here. It's about if there's a particular rule and if you would be able to either have to, let's say, pay less or to not follow it in a certain kind of context, or if you would have to pay more, or if you would have to do something greater than what the text actually has to say. So that's the idea of kula and chumra.
All right, muted myself. Okay, thank you so much. Let's go ahead on. I apologize for those of you who need to move off. If you are able to stay for one more bit of text, we'll look at one more together.
Okay, and again, I sincerely apologize about the delay. I will make sure in double time that if you decide to invite me back, that 9:30 will be the time. Okay, so what I want to do with this text is I'm not going to necessarily focus on how we better understand it because we have so many great translations that give us the larger context. I actually want to keep the text itself and the translation more direct in order to show how the Gemara is trying to resolve a question or to get to a final answer, and there's confusion about what the final answer is, partially because it's an oral text that's being passed down. And so you're going to see how there's a back and forth that was called Shakla Vitaria, the back and forth learning. So it brings in the example of an incident involving one who uncovered the head of a woman. I mentioned this as a part of the Mishnah earlier on, but just so you're aware, just to remind you, the incident was that a man uncovered the woman's head and therefore caused that humiliation, that damage to that person physically, and therefore that person was liable to pay compensation. Okay, so that's the particular story that's being referred to here. Now, I put into red the challenges or the questions about this text. What would be the she'ela of the particular on the particular text? Now, remember, in the answer to the particular example of the woman whose head was uncovered, Rabbi Akiva said, I will give extra time for the person to pay the damages. Okay? I'll give time. But, umi havinan zman. V'ha'amar Rabbi Chanina, ein notnin zman lachavalot. But do we give time? Doesn't Rabbi Chanina say, do not give time for injuries, meaning to pay compensation for injuries? So the particular question that's being asked is, how can Rabbi Akiva say, in this instance, we're going to give time to the person who is liable for compensation to actually pay up? That's not how it works. The answer, a quote from the Gemara, Ki la yahavinan leizman lechavala dechasre mamona, aval levoshet de la chasre mamona yahavinan. Again, you can kind of hear that sing-songy text to be able to remember it, like I was showing earlier. And the answer is fascinating, okay? When we do not give him time, that is regard to compensation with regard to injury, as he caused a monetary loss. Now, the fascinating thing about this whole text is that it's using words that seemingly mean one thing in one moment, but then can mean another thing in another moment. And one of those main words is chavala or chavalot. That is to say, chavala means injury, a personal injury, somebody who hurts you, right? We're talking about humiliation on the person. Therefore, that seems to be chavala, personal injury. But what the answer is to the text is that there's actually a difference between this physical injury and with regard to humiliation, to boshet. So now they're kind of splitting hairs between the two as a way to answer this question about why we give this person time. Because if somebody had injury, let's say if thinking about disability insurance, right? If you get harmed on the job and you can't work, then you're going to lose the ability to make money. Therefore, if you have a physical injury, you should get paid right away because you won't be able to do the things that you want to be able to do. However, when it comes to humiliation, which seemingly is different than personal injury, that you don't have that same loss of money right away. Therefore, you can give them time to be able to pay up. And so that makes, I think, logical sense, but it does raise the question that we're going to see now about, well, weren't we talking about personal injury as humiliation? Weren't they the same thing? Like I made a whole big point about how Jewish text does not really compensate for mental or spiritual pain. So what gives? Now it's going to bring in the next text, the next example the next text in the Mishnah to kind of build on this issue of the difference between chavala and boshet. He waited for her as she was standing by the opening of her courtyard. This text was, or the story was about the person who was liable for compensation, who wanted to prove that he wasn't actually humiliating her because she did it herself, right? She removed the the head covering immediately. She removed the head covering by her own volition when she wanted to. Therefore, it wasn't considered to be humiliation, and that was rejected by Rabbi Akiva as being a good answer. So, how is this challenge being used? Well, the challenge is first off used with beginning with the word vehatanya. If a text says vehatanya, that text it's about to bring is coming to make a challenge to what was said before. And the reason why this challenge is coming up is because Rabbi Akiva said something in our Mishnah that is different than what he said somewhere else. So this is what he said somewhere else. But isn't it taught by Rabbi Akiva? Rabbi Akiva said to this random guy, you plunged into mighty waters and you raised earthenware in your hand. And it shows that a person is permitted to injure himself. Adam rashai lachbol be'atzmo. Okay. I find this piece to be so fascinating because it is so confusing. What is it talking about here? A couple of things. Number one, this text from the Mishnaic period, this what's called a Braita, does not appear anywhere else in the Mishnah, nor does it appear anywhere else in Talmud. That is to say, this is a remembrance of something that Rabbi Akiva said. I wonder if they're remembering it correctly. And we talked about that last time that I was here about how there can be mistakes even in the way in which items or teachings are remembered. So that's one thing. But the other thing is, well, what is going on here and why are they bringing up this text? The idea of plunging into mighty waters and raising earthenware is this. You go into water, you're like, let's say you're in a gold rush and you're going into the water and saying, I know I'll find gold by going into this river. You go, you dig deep for gold, you work really hard, and all you come up with is earthenware, like a little pot. And then everyone's looking at you, that Nelson saying, see, you didn't get anything of value. Why are you doing this? That's the sense of being humiliated. Okay, that seems to be the particular context. And in that context, that phrase, Adam Rashai Lachbol Be'atzmo, that was Rabbi Akiva's answer, that a person is allowed to be able to cause injury to himself. He's allowed to make that mistake, if you will. Now, that doesn't seem to be that big of a deal, except to remember, I'm going to kind of pass by us for a second. If you see that the final text here that's also brought by this challenge, what's known as a kashya or kushya, it says, Hachovel be'atzmo afal pi she'eino rashai patur. This is the text that comes from our Mishnah, and that is said by Rabbi Akiva, meaning Rabbi Akiva is saying in one place, Hachovel be'atzmo afal pi she'eino rashai. Somebody who causes injury to himself, even though that's not permitted. That's from our Mishnah. But in a different place, in a Braita than which we don't know where it's come from, he says, Adam rashai lachbol be'atzmo. A person is permitted to injure himself. Therefore, Rabbi Akiva seems to be contradicting himself. And a lot of Talmudic learning is about resolving those seeming contradictions. It's not that they're saying, oi, he's wrong. It's saying, I don't understand. How could he say one thing in one place and something in another place? And that's one of the jobs that they're trying to do here. Now, Rava, or I should say that the Gemara in trying to answer it brings in Rava, who is trying to resolve this issue because he understands what's happening here. They're trying to get at how can Rabbi Akiva make this seeming contradiction? It doesn't seem to make any sense. And his answer is so fascinating because it also is very confusing and it is also beautiful. Amar Rava, la kasha, it's not an issue. Kan b'chavala, kan b'voshet. Meaning, Rava said it's not difficult. Here with regard to injury, there with regard to humiliation. And I'm thinking as I'm learning this, I'm like, which case are you talking about? I can't tell because chaval or chavala, lachbol, appears in our Mishnah. It also appears in this other Braita that, again, doesn't appear anywhere else. And we're also talking about boshet. We're talking about humiliation. And I thought that that was actually the same thing as chavala, as injury. But what Rava is saying is that there is a key difference between the two. Now, which is he talking about? Which is chavala? Which of these stories is personal injury, and which is boshet? Which is humiliation? And how does that actually help us resolve the issue? And here is the final saying on this particular text that will do the job of being able to hone in on what is the right answer to this question that we are asking, and how can we make sense of what Rabbi Akiva is saying. Hachi ka'amar le. This is said. La mi baya boshet. When it comes to issues of boshet, of humiliation, you don't need a particular text to say de adam rashai levayesh et atzmo. That you don't need a text to say that when that it is allowed for somebody to humiliate themselves. That should be a given, and that if somebody humiliates themselves, then somebody else is liable to be able to compensate that person. Meaning that in the case that we have in our Mishnah, the woman embarrassed herself. She was able to humiliate herself, but that doesn't mean that somebody else is allowed to do that. But the point of it saying la mi baya boshet, what it really means is we don't actually need to have a particular text that says that exact thing because it's a given. A lot of Talmudic learning is centered on the idea that certain things are a given, and it's only mentioned in order to teach something that would not be a given. So when it comes to humiliation, it should be a given. Ella afilu chavala de'ein adam rashai lechabel ba'atzmo. But when it comes to injury, where it is not permitted for a person to injure himself, acherim shechavlu bo chayavin. Others who injured him are liable. Meaning that when it comes to actual injury, to physical injury, we do need a text to be able to teach us this, because you would think, just from the logical inference here, that if a person is not allowed to injure himself, then other people who injure him do not have to be liable as well, because it's not something that is that makes logical sense if when you humiliate yourself, you're allowed to, but other people are not allowed to. That if you are not allowed to, then the other people should be allowed to harm you. And it uses this kind of comparison between chavala, between personal injury and humiliation, in a way to say that there's something different, but that they also share something. What that means, I think, is the notion that injury, personal injury, humiliation, whatever it may be, physical injury, emotional injury even, are similar but different. And they're trying to find how is it that they are, what is it that's actually different between the two? And there is a challenge that even the Talmud is raising in the way it's talking about these things, that they are different. They know something is different, but they can't necessarily really hone in on what exactly that is. Meaning, I know humiliation when I see it, and I know that you can generally humiliate yourself, but somebody else should not be allowed to. And I know that when it comes to something that you injure me, that they should be liable. However, at the same time, I'm not able to do that. And so if I put myself in a position where I could be injured, doesn't it mean that that person does not have to pay me? So that there's this complication about what it means to harm someone and to be harmed, and what the responsibilities are of the other person. Thus, at the very end of the day, I think that one of the fine ways of looking at this is by looking at deeper at what Rabbi Akiva is saying. It's giving us a more nuanced understanding about what injury could look like, that may be a forerunner to the notion of the differences between personal physical injury and mental spiritual injury as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi Sachs, for a thoughtful presentation. We should let people get on with their days, whatever time of day it is for them. But thank you so much for bringing these really interesting and thoughtful texts and analyses to us. Thank you, all of you. So many of you have stayed at 20 minutes past our end time to keep learning.
Amazing.
And it's lovely to be with you as always. And I hope you have a wonderful Thursday and a Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
All very soon. Thank you, Rabbi Sachs. Thank you, everybody.
Take care,
Goodbye.
everyone.